Man, I got to think it's an interesting week for legal pundits like our next guest, between the Idaho murder case and that arrest, between the Walsh murder arrest, and now the Alec Baldwin case. Rob Crain is joining me. He has been on lists like the U.S. News Best Lawyers in America, former president of the Dallas Bar Association. Rob Crain, great to have you back on the Scott Sands Show.
Good to hear your voice, Scott.
All right, we've been following the Alec Baldwin case for, a year now. Is it unusual that it's taken this long for prosecution to determine whether or not charges should be filed in the case?
I don't think the timing of these particular charges is unusual. They did already pursue and get a plea deal from the first director on the set. So, and that person was somebody we thought initially would be somebody targeted, while there was questions about, Mr. Baldwin and the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, and whether they would be charged. So I think the timing is consistent with a thoughtful investigation.
Explain the manslaughter charge and what that might mean for Alec Baldwin.
It's interesting. It's a involuntary manslaughter charge under New Mexico state law, and as I've been reading here, it has a negligence basis to it, a little above negligence, as the district attorney, Mary Carmack Altwies, explained. It's that they didn't exercise due caution or circumspection. And if those are the elements of the crime, and we're talking about, that they didn't use, basic safety measures in a dangerous condition situation. When you're pointing a firearm at somebody, a working firearm at someone, you didn't use the basic safety standards. So that's what we're looking at here. We're not looking at an intentional crime. We're not looking at something that's highly elevated with intent, and I don't believe anybody believes that Mr. Baldwin acted intentionally in this manner to hurt somebody.
What it demonstrates to me is what little Alec Baldwin and perhaps many other actors know about firearms. As someone who has a concealed carry permit, if somebody were to hand me a gun, whether they said it was a prop gun, a toy gun, an unloaded real gun, whatever the circumstance, I'm going to look in the chamber. I'm going to look in the magazine. I'm going to investigate the gun before I even handle it, so I know exactly what I have been handled. It shows me that Alec Baldwin really had no firearms training or regards for firearms safety. That doesn't necessarily mean he is completely to blame, but if you're using firearms on a set and real firearms that may be loaded with blanks, then he should have at least been trained on basic handgun safety.
Well, and that's what the district attorney focused on in the limited comments I've been able to see today. She said he didn't check it. That was what she really focused on, was that he didn't bother to check the gun, as you just alluded to. And it just happenstance, for the first time in 10 years, my father and I got to go duck hunting this past weekend with some other folks. And at the end of the hunt, we were picking things up and so forth, and one of those was another person's gun. And, my father taught me, like you just said, you check the gun, and I recognized that the chamber was not loaded, but there was a shell underneath. And, stopped and asked questions, and that was not intended, and we took that shell out of the chamber. And that's what you do. That, as you noted, basic safety with a firearm is the first thing you do is you presume it's loaded, you check to make sure it's not loaded, and those basic safety steps, were not followed here. And the DA made a point. This wasn't just him as the actor handling the gun. He was also the producer of this movie, and with that comes responsibility for safety on that set. And she made a point that this was, this elevated his responsibility even beyond the person handling the gun.
Yeah, there were breakdowns on multiple levels, but he was the last person with the gun before the incident occurred, and the final, in my opinion, the final safety check is on him, is on Alec Baldwin. But is this a case that will actually go to trial, or can Alec Baldwin plead this down to a lesser charge of negligence?
I think the options here are fairly clear because, as I mentioned, the assistant director, David Halls, was previously charged in this case, and he was the one who handed the gun to Mr. Baldwin, as well as not doing what he needed to do to make sure that that live rounds and dummy rounds weren't being mixed, and he was the one who knew of complaints on the set about safety and so forth, and he was able to plead to a misdemeanor charge of negligent use of a deadly weapon. He had received a suspended sentence, 6 months probation. And with his level of culpability arguably being higher than Mr. Baldwin's and potentially Ms. Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, my suspicions are that type of plea deal will be on the table for Mr. Baldwin as well. The question is going to be whether or not he will take it and admit to a lesser misdemeanor, or if he wants to fight it to try to clear his name. And that'll be the question. I think it'll be up to him rather than up to the DAs.
And I've got to imagine that this is something weighing on Alec Baldwin emotionally, as it should, and will have an impact on the film industry for years to come, in my opinion.
I think that's what the district attorney is saying between the lines in the comments that I've read today, is that this is an example. As we just talked about, I don't think there's going to be any prison time being even discussed here. This is about, hey, every person is, nobody's above the law, including A-list actors, and that this is an example of stop, let's do a double check here on what we're supposed to do, check firearms, have basic gun safety, and that this is an example that we're going to highlight and make sure this doesn't happen in the future. And look, Mr. Baldwin, that day that it happened, I recall very pointedly the images of his emotional reaction that day, and clearly he was impacted by it. There have been some things that have occurred in the news since then, which not hit the right note, I don't believe, but
right.
But I believe that this is an example that's being set for, hey, let's do better in the future.
Yeah, he's a cocky and polarizing guy for sure, but that shouldn't play into his legal culpability by any means. We're talking to nationally renowned attorney Rob Crain here on the Scott Sancho. Two other cases getting a lot of national attention. Yesterday, the search warrant was unsealed in the arrest of Brian Koberger's, the search of his apartment. This is the Moscow, Idaho murder case, and we're learning a lot more evidence has actually been in the custody of police, and they're building a much stronger case against this guy.
Yeah, and I've been watching that tangentially. It's just so heartbreaking. And as you know, I deal with catastrophic injury and death cases. I moderate how much more death and I take in on a daily basis in my news. But in having watched this, it looks like I've got to applaud those people who have been investigating this. It's been a difficult crime to investigate because it's been somewhat random, and the number of interviews taking place, the amount of tedious evidence, the patience they used in before making the arrest. I really applaud those investigators and law enforcement here in trying to do a thorough job under limited evidence, and it looks like they're on the right track here.
Yeah, and this is a case that we may learn more about this suspect as it goes to trial, and this was either the apprehension and prevention of future murders, or this guy has committed other crimes that we're not sure about yet.
I've just, like I said, I've read bits and pieces here, and I read a comment this morning about, he had a social media post or made comment in a similar platform about, him, being able to, that things don't impact him. He can do bad and it won't impact him. And I may have it a little off. Folks can double check me on that. But I think what we're starting to see, as well as what his background was and the major and coursework he was taking, it's starting to shape up like this was somebody who was trying to just put his own personal curiosity of can I get away with it, personal curiosity of, how, bad can I do and not have consequence to a test here. And, that's pure speculation on my part, but we're starting to see some of those kinds of signs which, certainly point, to questions of mental health and that sort of thing on this case. So, I think there's many layers here yet to be peeled back.
He certainly thought he was smarter than investigators would have been after committing the crime. On the opposite end of the spectrum, though, is Brian Walsh in Massachusetts, arrested finally. This is a guy, I would hate to be his defense attorney, Even though a body has not been found, and you can tell me how peculiar it is for murder charges to be filed when there is no body, but this guy went out and bought $500 in cleaning supplies and left a hatchet at his mother's house and was doing Google searches on how to dismember and dispose of a body.
Yeah, this one I've purposely avoided as much as I can, other than the headlines on, and for the reasons you're stating. This is diabolical, and what I've seen here, it is just heinous. It is awful. It's one of those that's going to get the headlines, and this is just one of those scary stories in America that we all need to take notice of. And take, like I said, the mental health issues here in this country. It's one where we need to lead the way in the world, and this is a prime example of that. We don't know exactly what's going to come out, as far as the issues of finding the actual body here and all of what's behind this person. But this is one of these scary, scary stories that just is everyone's nightmare.
How challenging is it for the prosecution to bring a murder case, a murder charge, when there is no body?
It's not as hard as it used to be. Historically, we didn't have as much, scientific evidence, the tools necessary to prove. But it's become, relatively speaking, in the last 20 years, we're seeing more of that, and we're seeing it done more effectively. I don't think it's going to be as large of an issue in this case based on what I've seen thus far. There's just such strong evidence here. It's one of these few cases where I don't think the prosecutors are as worried as DAs have been historically on that issue.
Interesting stuff, Rob. I appreciate your time as always.
Anytime.